I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary that afternoon. The sun was low, golden light spilling across the quiet neighborhood streets, and I had just parked near the corner store for a quick errand. That's when I saw her, a woman in her early 40s, tall, elegant, moving with a kind of grace that immediately caught my eye, yet slightly weighed down by the grocery bags in her hands. She was clearly struggling, and not just with the weight of the bags. There was a quiet hesitation in her movements, a kind of carefulness, as though every step had to be measured. My first thought was simple: help. "Hey, do you want a hand with those?" I asked, trying to sound casual, not too eager. Her gaze lifted to meet mine. There was a flicker in her eyes, surprise, maybe amusement, maybe suspicion. She studied me for a moment, this stranger offering unsolicited help, and then her lips curved into a soft, reluctant smile. Sure, thank you," she said, handing over a bag. Even that simple gesture was electrifying in its own way. Her hand brushed mine as she passed it over, and the contact lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Not enough to be bold, but just enough to make me notice the warmth of her skin, the faint softness under her fingers. Her perfume followed her, subtle, floral, a little woody, and it stuck in my mind long after. As we started walking toward her car, I realized I didn't want the moment to end. She moved with confidence, but there was something quietly vulnerable about the way she balanced the bags, the little sigh she gave as the weight shifted from one arm to the other. We exchanged small talk, light, mundane conversation about the weather, the store, the neighborhood, but even in the ordinary, there was something magnetic. Her voice was steady, mature, with a timbre that seemed to invite trust, yet carried a hint of loneliness, like she was used to doing things alone. I noticed how her eyes tracked my steps, how her lips twitched into a smile when she laughed softly at one of my jokes. Her shoulder brushed against mine more than once, accidental or not, and I felt my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just attraction, it was a quiet recognition that there was more behind those eyes than she let on. By the time we reached her car, I knew I wanted to know her story, not the surface details, but the ones hidden in the pauses, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the small, almost imperceptible sighs that escaped when she adjusted the grocery bags. As she fumbled with her keys, I handed her the last bag, and our fingers touched again. This time, I lingered slightly longer, enough to feel the pulse beneath her skin, the subtle warmth that made me aware of my own heartbeat. She smiled again, this time a little softer, a little more open, and in that moment, I realized that helping with groceries wasn't just a simple act of kindness. Somehow, it had become the start of something far more complicated, and far more thrilling, than I had expected. We walked in silence at first, the soft crunch of pavement under our shoes filling the space between words. I carried most of the groceries, though she insisted on holding a few lighter bags. There was a quiet rhythm to our steps, the kind that made it feel like the world around us had slowed just a little. She glanced at me, her expression open yet guarded, and I realized that in the brief moments before, I had been studying her as much as she had been studying me. She had an elegance that didn't demand attention but drew it naturally, the way her shoulders relaxed when she thought no one was looking, the subtle sway of her hair as it caught the sunlight. She was in her early 40s, confident and self-assured, but there was a gentleness in her movements that suggested layers beneath the surface. "I live just a few blocks away," she said finally, breaking the quiet. Her voice was soft, measured, carrying a warmth that made me feel immediately at ease. "I usually manage on my own, but these were heavier than I expected." She laughed lightly, and it wasn't loud or boisterous, just enough to make the moment intimate. We fell into casual conversation, about the neighborhood, the little shops nearby, and the way the afternoon light softened the streets. As she spoke, I noticed the way her hands moved naturally, expressive but restrained, and the way her eyes caught the sunlight, turning a subtle shade of hazel that I hadn't seen until now. At one point, she shifted a bag in her hands, and her elbow brushed against mine. It was accidental, I'm sure, yet it sent a jolt through me I didn't expect. Her warmth lingered, not in a way that was forward, but in a quiet, grounding way, a reminder that proximity could be comforting, even electrifying. I caught myself glancing at her more than once, noticing the small details, the curve of her smile, the gentle crease near her eyes when she laughed, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the afternoon air. Somehow, the walk became more than just a journey to her home. It felt like an exchange, a delicate negotiation between curiosity and caution, between wanting to reach out and needing to respect boundaries. Her voice had a natural cadence, rising and falling with sincerity, and when she laughed at one of my clumsy jokes, it was as if the world had momentarily brightened just for us. By the time we reached the small gate to her house, I realized that this short walk, nothing more than carrying groceries a few blocks, had become an experience I didn't want to end. The way her fingers brushed mine when she reached for the gate handle, the tilt of her head as she looked up at me, the soft exhale as she balanced the last bag in her hands, it all spoke of a quiet intimacy forming without words. I felt the first real flutter of something unexpected, a connection that went beyond mere politeness or chance encounter. She was intriguing, guarded yet open, and I had a sudden, undeniable desire to see more of the person behind the smile, to hear more of her stories, to understand the subtle loneliness I sensed beneath her confidence. And as she stepped inside her gate, giving me a small, almost shy smile, I knew I wanted to walk this path with her, literally and figuratively, wherever it might lead. We reached her front door, and she paused, fumbling with her keys for a moment. The air between us felt different here, quieter, heavier in a way I hadn't noticed on the walk. I was about to hand her the last bag when she looked up at me, her eyes holding something that made my chest tighten. "You know," she began, hesitating. "If you don't mind, would you like to come in for a moment? I could use a hand putting these groceries away." I blinked, momentarily surprised. It wasn't an invitation I was expecting. But there was no awkwardness in her tone, just a quiet, measured openness that made it hard to refuse. I nodded, and together we stepped inside. Her home was exactly as I had imagined from glimpses through the gate, lived in yet orderly, warm without being fussy, a place that clearly reflected her personality. A vase of fading wildflowers sat on the windowsill, and the faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air. Sunlight streamed in through sheer curtains, painting soft patterns on the wooden floor. It was peaceful, quiet, yet filled with subtle energy, like a space that held memories and stories in its corners. We moved toward the kitchen, and I set down the grocery bags. As I reached for a carton of milk, her hand brushed against mine. It was so slight, almost accidental, but it lingered, a fleeting touch that left a warmth I couldn't ignore. Her fingers were soft, deliberate, and for a moment I felt a quiet pulse of connection. She looked up at me, and our eyes met, both of us aware of that brief contact. While putting away the groceries, I noticed the little details that made her space feel alive, the stacked cookbooks with notes in the margins, the way a colorful tea towel hung just so, the gentle hum of the refrigerator. She moved with calm confidence, yet there was a subtle grace in how she navigated her kitchen, adjusting bags and jars with care. Watching her, I realized I was drawn not just to her appearance, though she was undeniably striking, but to the ease and authenticity she carried in her movements. At one point, she handed me a small bag of fresh fruit, our fingers brushing again. She laughed softly, almost shyly, as if surprised by the proximity. It wasn't bold, it wasn't flirtatious in an obvious way, it was a quiet, understated intimacy that made the moment linger far longer than it should have. I became acutely aware of the small sounds, the soft thud of the groceries on the counter, her breath catching slightly as she lifted a heavier bag, the distant chirp of birds outside. By the time the groceries were unpacked, the initial tension had softened. She offered a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of the shared moment. That brief invitation, something so ordinary, had transformed a simple act of help into a delicate, unspoken connection. I realized then that I didn't want to leave, not yet. There was a story here, a quiet pull I couldn't name, but I knew it was worth exploring. And as I glanced around her kitchen one last time before setting down the final bag, I felt a spark, subtle, warming, and impossible to ignore, that this encounter was only the beginning. Once the groceries were unpacked, She paused and glanced at me with a faint, almost mischievous smile. "Would you like to stay for a cup of tea, or maybe help me cook something simple?" she asked. I felt a rush of both surprise and curiosity. Cooking together wasn't something I had expected from this casual encounter, yet there was something inviting in the way she asked, a quiet warmth that made me want to say yes, even if it was just to prolong this strange, comforting closeness. We moved to the kitchen island, and she began gathering ingredients for a simple stir-fry. I offered to chop vegetables, though my skills were admittedly limited. She laughed softly, the sound low and melodic, and leaned close to guide my hands over the knife and cutting board. Her fingers brushed mine as she adjusted my grip, and I felt a jolt of warmth that was both thrilling and grounding. It wasn't a flirtation, it was intimacy, subtle and profound in its gentleness. As we worked side by side, I noticed more of the details I hadn't before, the delicate curve of her neck as she tilted her head to show me a technique, the faint scent of citrus from the vegetables mingling with the perfume that clung to her, the way sunlight danced across her hair in streaks of gold and chestnut. There was a natural rhythm to our movements, almost like an unspoken conversation between hands and gestures. She caught me fumbling with a knife and placed her hand lightly over mine again. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice soft yet confident. The warmth of her palm against mine lingered, and for a moment I was acutely aware of how close we were, shoulder to shoulder, side by side, sharing the small space of her kitchen. It was domestic, ordinary even, but charged with a quiet intimacy I hadn't anticipated. We laughed at my clumsy attempts, teasing each other gently, and she glanced at me occasionally with a softness in her eyes that made my heart tighten. There was no rush, no pressure, just the slow, deliberate unfolding of a moment that felt suspended outside of time. When the vegetables sizzled in the pan, the aroma filling the kitchen, she leaned close to stir them, her arm brushing mine. I could feel the subtle pulse of her movement, the faint heat radiating from her body. It was intoxicating in its simplicity, this shared task, this unspoken connection forming in the quiet corners of her home. By the time the meal was plated, and we sat at the small kitchen table, I realized that what had begun as helping her carry groceries had evolved into something profoundly personal. The laughter, the guiding hands, the fleeting touches, it all created a sense of closeness I hadn't expected, yet now found impossible to ignore. And as I met her gaze across the table, I sensed she felt it too, that unspoken pull, the quiet thrill of a connection neither of us fully understood, yet both were willing to explore. Dinner was simple, the stir-fry we had prepared together, served in mismatched plates that somehow added warmth to the scene. We sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, the space between us intimate yet respectful. The soft clink of utensils against the plates, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional creak of the wooden floor under our chairs created a rhythm that made the room feel alive with small, delicate sounds. We ate mostly in comfortable silence at first, but then her voice broke through, softer now, almost tentative. "It's been a long time since I had someone to share a meal with," she admitted, her eyes flicking to mine and then away, as though revealing too much. There was no bitterness in her tone, only an honest vulnerability I hadn't expected. I felt a sudden pull in my chest. I knew what it was like to crave connection, to feel the quiet weight of loneliness even amidst the busyness of life. I can understand that," I said carefully, wanting my words to be gentle, not intrusive. "It's nice, having someone to talk to, even over something as ordinary as dinner." Her eyes softened, and for a moment they held me, warm, steady, and searching. There was something unspoken in the way she watched me, a quiet acknowledgement that this shared moment was more than just casual company. I could see her relax as she set down her fork, the tension that had lingered in her shoulders easing ever so slightly. As we continued talking, she told me a little more about herself, not the mundane details of her work or errands, but small personal truths, how she loved mornings with sunlight streaming in through her windows, how she sometimes felt invisible in the daily rush, how she missed the simple intimacy of shared moments. I listened, captivated not just by her words, but by the sincerity and courage behind them. At one point, her hand brushed against mine on the table, just lightly, as if by accident, yet long enough to feel her warmth and the subtle tremor of honesty in her touch. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers linger near hers, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone in that moment. The candlelight flickered across her face, highlighting the soft lines of her smile and the depth of her eyes. There was a quiet tension building between us, not a rush or urgency, but the kind of slow, simmering awareness that makes every glance, every touch, and every pause feel weighted with meaning. By the time dinner ended, I realized the gravity of what had happened in such a short time. This woman, confident, self-sufficient, and undeniably alluring, had allowed me into a part of herself that few people saw. And I, in turn, had been changed simply by witnessing it. As she cleared the plates and we worked side by side, there was a subtle, electric intimacy in the air, the soft brush of our arms, the quiet laughter, the gentle unspoken understanding that something more than friendship was beginning to take root. It was in that moment, standing in her kitchen, amidst the ordinary hum of evening life, that I knew this was no longer about groceries. Something deeper, slower, and profoundly human was beginning to grow between us. The evening had settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm. The dishes were stacked neatly in the sink, the faint scent of the stir-fry lingering in the warm kitchen air. We moved side by side, washing and drying plates in near silence, and for a while, the closeness felt natural, effortless. Her hand brushed mine occasionally, fleeting touches that left a lingering warmth, subtle reminders of the intimacy forming between us. But then, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere shifted. She paused mid-motion, her hands hovering over a dish, and I noticed a flicker in her eyes, hesitation, uncertainty, a sudden distance that hadn't been there before. I should probably not, she began, her voice soft, hesitant. She swallowed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a towel. I mean, it might not look right. You know, people might misunderstand. I froze, not because of what she said, but because of the weight behind it. The age difference, something I hadn't really thought about until this moment, hovered between us like a quiet, invisible wall. I could feel the pull toward her, the desire to bridge that gap, yet I also understood the caution in her words. Her hand lingered near mine for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt the warmth of her skin, the subtle heartbeat beneath her touch. Yet she stepped back, as if reminding herself of boundaries she had set long ago. Her eyes were soft, glistening ever so slightly under the warm kitchen light, and her lips parted, as though she wanted to say more but stopped herself. I wanted to reach out, to assure her, to tell her that this, whatever this was between us, felt natural and right. But instead, I let silence fill the space, letting her set the pace. I realized that sometimes the most meaningful connection isn't in rushing forward, but in honoring hesitation, in allowing someone the space to reconcile their emotions without pressure. We continued tidying in quiet coordination, the tension neither heavy nor hostile, just a delicate pause, a quiet acknowledgement that something profound was building, yet needed careful tending. I noticed how she lingered near the counter, occasionally glancing at me with a mix of longing and restraint. Her small, subtle gestures, a touch of the wrist, a soft sigh, a fleeting smile, spoke volumes, more than words ever could. And in that moment, I understood something important. The slow burn of connection, the gentle unfolding of trust and desire, is what makes it meaningful. It wasn't about forcing closeness or pretending the age gap didn't exist. It was about respecting it, acknowledging it, and letting the emotions simmer quietly, allowing them to grow naturally. As she finally stepped back and gave me a small, almost apologetic smile, I felt an odd mixture of longing and reassurance. She was hesitant, yes, but the truth in her eyes, the subtle invitation beneath her caution, told me that this wasn't the end. It was merely a pause, a moment to breathe before the next step. And standing there, side by side in the kitchen, I realized that the tension itself had become part of the intimacy, the silent conversation between two hearts learning to navigate closeness carefully, thoughtfully, and with hope. By the time the dishes were put away and the kitchen returned to its quiet, orderly state, the night had deepened outside, the golden warmth of evening fading into a cool, serene darkness. The small clock on her wall ticked softly, but in the room, time seemed to stretch, slowed by the intimacy of shared moments and the weight of unspoken feelings. I moved toward the door, groceries long since put away, heart heavy with a mixture of anticipation and the gentle ache of hesitation. She followed, her steps quiet on the wooden floor, her eyes searching mine with that same complex blend of confidence, curiosity, and vulnerability I had noticed from the very beginning. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten. "For today, for helping, and for staying." Her words were simple, but the underlying emotion resonated far deeper than their surface meaning. I stepped closer, not pushing, not rushing, just allowing the moment to exist. She placed her hand lightly on my wrist, the touch deliberate yet tender, holding me in place without a word. Her fingers were warm, and I could feel the subtle pulse beneath her skin. It was a gesture of trust, of quiet courage, and it sent a jolt of awareness through me that this connection, slow, measured, and wholly unexpected, had become something I didn't want to let go of. I'd like to come by again," I said, keeping my voice calm, steady. "Not to help with groceries. Just to spend time with you." A soft laugh escaped her, light and genuine, breaking through the tension that had lingered all evening. Her eyes sparkled in the dim light, reflecting the flicker of candles we had left on the counter. "I think I'd like that too," she admitted, a smile curving gently on her lips. Then, as if to punctuate the night with quiet affection, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to my cheek. It was fleeting, deliberate, and brimming with tenderness, a promise, a greeting, a whisper of something more. I felt the warmth linger where her lips had touched, and her hand remained lightly on my wrist for a heartbeat longer before letting go. We stood there for a moment, caught between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between goodbye and anticipation. The subtle tension of hesitation, the quiet intimacy, and the unspoken understanding all converged into a delicate, electric pause that neither of us wanted to end. As I stepped into the cool night air, the soft glow of the street lamp illuminating the path ahead, I realized the truth of what had unfolded. Helping her with groceries had been the spark, but the real story was in the small touches, the laughter, the shared silences, and the honesty we had offered each other. I knew, without needing words, that this was only the beginning. A slow, tender journey had begun, one built on trust, respect, and the quiet thrill of closeness. And somewhere between the ordinary act of carrying groceries and the extraordinary intimacy of a shared evening, we had discovered a connection that was real, meaningful, and utterly impossible to ignore. For the first time that night, I smiled fully, feeling the weight of anticipation and warmth settle comfortably in my chest. And as I walked down the street, I knew I would return, not as someone helping her, but as someone who had been invited into her life in the most extraordinary way.